October 9th, 1976. 10:18 p.m. Cell Block C, 74, Rikers Island. A man nicknamed Erlene, white, loud, and drunk on attention, leaned over the second-tier rail and turned Frank Lucas into a public joke. In that place, ridicule was a blade. If Frank snapped, he'd be boxed up or bled out. If he stayed quiet, the whole tier would smell weakness and come feeding. Frank looked up through the bars, measured the faces watching him, and smiled, small, calm, almost polite, as if he'd just been handed terms. Above, the fluorescent lights buzzed, and somewhere a radio hissed, like the building enjoyed secrets. Frank was 46, state khakis on his back, shoelaces tied tight, eyes alert as cash. He'd been brought here on a mix of state and federal trouble, but his real sentence was uncertainty. A transfer list for 8 a.m. tomorrow, and a lawyer's call he could only make from one guarded phone. Outside, his name still moved money, still moved fear, still moved men. Inside, a single humiliation could turn him into prey. The block ran on cars, debts, and favors. Guards sold quiet, inmates sold violence, and everybody sold information. Frank had learned, the lie in jail becomes truth. Erlene wasn't big, but he had a comedian's timing and a bully's need for applause. He pointed at Frank's cell and shouted, "Harlem King, smile for us." A couple men laughed too hard. Dominoes paused. Even the bubble officer, Sergeant Kelly, looked up from paperwork. Kelly was thick-necked, hungry, and famous for charging inmates twice. Once with discipline, once with deals. Erlene's words weren't just racist. They were strategic, delivered during shift change chaos, when cameras blinked and doors buzzed by mistake. The tier waited for Frank to react. Frank didn't move fast. He moved like a man choosing a suit. From his bunk, Frank stood slowly, not to fight, but to be seen standing. He kept his hands loose at his sides and looked up at Erlene as if studying a menu. "You talk loud for someone who sleeps with his shoes on," Frank said. The line wasn't funny. It was surgical. Some men snorted, then swallowed it. Erlene's grin twitched. Up on the rail, a quiet enforcer called Pastor watched without blinking, and Pastor's stillness carried more weight than Erlene's mouth. Frank smiled again, and to the careless it looked soft. To Pastor it looked like planning for later. By 10:41 p.m., the story had sprinted cell to cell. Lucas got punked, Lucas smiled, Lucas wouldn't swing. Sergeant Kelly walked the tier with his flashlight low, stopping at Frank's bars like a man checking inventory. "You got trouble," Kelly murmured. "Trouble can be managed." Frank didn't ask what he meant. He asked the price. 200 in commissary tonight, Kelly said. "And you keep your hands clean." Frank's eyes stayed steady. "Protection from him," Frank said. "Or protection for him." Kelly's smile tightened, then vanished. Down the run, somebody whistled a tune, the kind you hear before doors open. Frank's cellmate, a quiet Puerto Rican named Lalo, kept reading his paperback, but his eyes tracked reflections in the scratched steel mirror. "That wasn't random," Lalo said. "Erlene's been meeting Kelly's runner near the laundry door." Frank nodded once. He'd already noticed the timing. The insult landed exactly as paperwork stacked up, exactly when the stairwell camera stuttered for 8 seconds, exactly when the bubble door clicked too easily. Someone wanted a reaction on tape. Someone wanted a disciplinary ticket, a reason to isolate Frank before morning transport. And someone inside Frank's car was feeding details to the wrong pocket. Frank didn't strike back. He did what he'd always done with danger. He priced it, mapped it, and bought its weak points. He watched who ate with whom, who controlled the payphone, who ran commissary deliveries, who owed ramen, who owed blood. He watched Kelly's habits. Coffee at 11:20, paperwork at 11:55, bathroom at 12:08. He watched doors, which latch stuck, which hinge squealed, which lock clicked twice. In prison, rhythm was a weapon. Frank's smile was bait. His real plan was to make the block itself testify himself. At 11:07 p.m., Pastor came down the stairs like he was late for a meeting. He stopped at Frank's bars, voice low, polite, deadly. "Erlene wants an apology," he said. Loud. Same rail he used. Frank leaned in, as if considering a deal. "That's not apology," Frank said. "That's ownership." Pastor's eyes didn't change. "You got till midnight." Frank looked past Pastor to the bubble, to Kelly, to the posted count board. "Midnight's a busy time," Frank said. "Busy is when men make mistakes." Pastor paused, then walked away uneasy. Above, Erlene laughed, tasting tomorrow's transfer like victory for him. Frank finally understood the play. Erlene was a spark, but the gasoline sat behind glass. Tomorrow's transfer wasn't routine, it was erasure. If Frank left C-74, he lost his one protected call, his one friendly clerk, and the paper trail he'd hidden inside a law book spine. Somebody with keys wanted him cut off before sunrise. Lalo confirmed it with a whisper from the shower line. Kelly's runner had bragged about sending Lucas upstate for a bonus. Frank didn't rage. He felt calm settle deeper, like ice. The enemy wasn't Erlene's mouth. It was Kelly's hunger and the man's fear. At 11:44 p.m., Frank raised his voice so nearby cells could hear without it sounding like a speech. "Erlene," he called. The tear quieted, hungry. Erlene leaned out, grinning. "You ready to beg?" Frank nodded once, as if agreeing. "Midnight," he said. "Same rail. You want it loud, I'll make it loud." Men exchanged looks. Loud meant witnesses. Loud meant responsibility. Sergeant Kelly hurried over, irritation sharp. "Don't start nothing," he warned. Frank didn't look at him. "Then stop winding it," Frank said, and Kelly's eyes flicked toward the service door like a guilty man checking a window too often. October 10th, 12 a.m. The stairwell camera light stuttered. 8 seconds of blindness everyone ignored. Erlene stood at the rail, arms spread, drinking attention. Frank stepped into the corridor, palms open, because in jail optics were armor. "Say it," Erlene shouted. Frank lifted his chin. "You're right," he said, and the tear gasped. Erlene laughed. Frank went louder. "This ain't Harlem. In Harlem, loud men get buried. In here, loud men get used." He faced the bubble. "Who told you to bark tonight?" Frank asked. Erlene's eyes flicked toward Kelly before his mouth could lie. The story rewrote the room. For a moment, it worked. Pastor raised a hand from the stairs, signaling calm. "Enough," he called. Everybody heard it. Erlene forced a laugh, pretending he'd won anyway, and started backing toward the tier gate. Dominoes clicked again. A TV volume crept up. Kelly exhaled like paperwork had been avoided. Frank turned back toward his cell, and Lalo's eyes asked, "Is it over?" Frank didn't answer because he saw the service door at the far end crack open. Just a finger of darkness, just enough to promise something unofficial was about to step into the official space. Right on cue. At 12:09 a.m., Kelly's radio crackled with a call that sounded wrong. Too clean, too convenient. Kelly walked away from the bubble, leaving the door controls to a younger officer inside. Pastor moved down 2 steps, posture shifting from mediator to manager. Erlene reappeared with 2 friends, trying to look casual, failing. "Apology," Pastor said again, voice soft but final. Frank felt the block tighten like a fist. If he apologized, he died slowly. If he refused, he'd be written up, isolated, and shipped out at dawn. He needed a third option. Make the system trip over its own setup tonight. Frank raised his hands higher, palms open, and spoke loud. "Don't touch me," he said, before anyone had touched him. That sentence was a flare. An older inmate down the run, respected, quiet, credible, shouted, "Officer, that service door's open." Head snapped. The bubble officer leaned forward. Pastor's eyes flicked toward the crack in the door, because that door was the real crime. Erlene panicked at the attention and reached for Frank's shirt, trying to claim control. Frank stepped back, still open-palmed, making sure everyone saw it. Erlene moved first. The corridor filled with noise that turned a setup into evidence fast. Noise slammed the corridor. A figure slipped from the service door. then froze as faces turned. The bubble officer buzzed doors by mistake. Pastor shoved between bodies. Erlene lunged to grab Frank's shirt, try to own the moment, and then he recoiled with a sharp yelp, hands clamped to his head. The block went still. No gore, just absence, the clean missing shape where his ear had been. Men stared, understanding the message. Erlene screamed and pointed at Frank. Frank stood open-palmed. "I never touched him," he said. Kelly didn't argue. The setup had become evidence for the whole tier. Medical arrived fast, not from compassion, but from fear of reports. Erlene was hustled down the run, still shouting, still trying to sound in control, but his voice cracked. Men watched him like a warning sign being carried away. Pastor remained on the stairs, eyes measuring who would blame whom. The service door figure vanished into the hall before anyone could name him. Frank walked back into his cell without triumph. Triumph invited retaliation. Lalo whispered, "You didn't touch him." Frank shrugged. "I didn't have to. The story. The man who laughed at Lucas lost an ear, and Lucas never swung." Kelly retreated to the bubble, whispering, panic wrapped in procedure. The transfer plan was now risky. Moving Frank would look personal. Pastor returned to Frank's bars. "You made it loud," he said. Frank answered flat. "You made it first." Pastor's eyes narrowed. "This ain't finished." Frank nodded. "Nothing is." On bunks, men pretended to sleep while their minds replayed the open service door and Erlene's glance toward Kelly. Nobody needed details. The meaning was enough. In jail, meaning is protection. By making the setup public, Frank had bought himself a wall of witnesses without paying $1 before dawn arrived. At 6:12 a.m., lights snapped on and the block woke angry. A lieutenant walked the tier with a clipboard, asking about the service door and the midnight disturbance. Men stared at concrete, weighing loyalty against being set up again. Frank said nothing, letting the room remember for him. Kelly hovered behind the lieutenant, sweating under real supervision. The lieutenant stopped at Frank's cell. "Lucas, you involved?" Frank looked steady. "I was where your people could see me," he said. "Check your cameras." The lieutenant's eyes went to the stairwell lens, then back to Kelly. For the time, Kelly looked small. By 7:05 a.m., Kelly was benched and the service door inspected. It was a pause, not peace. Frank got 10 minutes on the guarded phone. He dialed from memory. A woman answered. Frank kept his voice level. "The bus is delayed," he said. "Move the papers. Lock the cash. No visitors." She understood without asking. The line clicked dead. Relief brushed him. Then he saw Pastor on the stairs, staring like a man reading a ledger. In this place, relief was rented. Frank returned to his cell, knowing the next move would be quiet, because someone still wanted him erased. By 9:30 a.m., Kelly was off the tier, but his influence lingered in small mistakes. Doors held open too long, searches done out of order, runners passing whispers like contraband. A note reached Frank through a tattooed kid. "Yard 1115, near the east fence, to talk." In prison, talk meant a trap with witnesses missing. The transfer was delayed, not dead, and the men who'd failed at midnight needed an angle. Frank chose the strategy: patience. He watched shadows, counted steps, memorized who stood where during movement. At 10:52, Lalo murmured, "They're resetting." Frank nodded. "Good," he said. "Resets create seams." 11:15 a.m. yard time. Gray sky, wet concrete, chain link. Men kept moving because standing still invited problems. Frank walked toward the east fence where Pastor waited by the handball wall. Two followers stood behind Pastor like punctuation. A officer leaned, pretending boredom. Pastor didn't greet. "You made it loud," he said. Frank answered. "Loud keeps me alive." Pastor's eyes stayed flat. "Erlene's hurt. He blames you." Frank shrugged. He chose the stage. Pastor leaned closer. "You think witnesses save you? Witnesses disappear." Frank smiled once. "Then you should stop creating witnesses." Pastor's jaw tightened, because the threat cut both ways. Pastor lowered his voice. "This ain't about Arlene," he said. "It's about what you're carrying." Frank's smile faded. "Everybody carries something," he replied. Pastor's eyes flicked to Frank's pocket. "Paper," Pastor said. "Names. Amounts. Badges you can burn." Frank felt the lock-in. Someone had told them about his hidden pages. A leak lived close, maybe inside his own crew. Pastor offered terms like a banker. Hand it over, and you ride quiet. Keep it, and you ride out hurting. Frank inhaled once. "You don't even know who you're collecting for," he said. Pastor's mouth curled. "I know who pays." Frank nodded like he might surrender. "Tonight," he said. "You want paper, you get it tonight." Pastor held his stare. "No games." Frank answered, "No mistakes." He walked away, but his fingers tapped the spine of his law book, a signal to Lalo. Back in the cell, Frank opened the book and slid out a thin bundle of pages. Decoy pages, blank except for one line. October 10th, 9:47 p.m., service door. The real list was already off the tier, moved through the morning call. Frank's preparation wasn't fists, it was angles. He needed witnesses pointed at the right door. At lock-in, he'd hand pass to the decoy and let the guards discover the note. October 10th, 9:47 p.m. lock-in. Pastor reached Frank's cell with an officer's help. "The paper," Pastor said. Frank handed him the bundle. Pastor flipped it and read the only line. October 10th, 9:47 p.m., service door. He looked up, angry, too late. The lieutenant arrived, eyes fixed on the service door. This time uniforms watched, not inmates. Kelly rushed in and started explaining, which sounded like guilt. The lieutenant's gaze moved from the door to Pastor to Kelly. "So this is the routine," he said. Pastor backed away. Frank stayed behind bars, calm, because he'd turned their scheme into a report. At 2:10 a.m., Frank was moved into administrative segregation for safety, a box with no phone. The lieutenant protected the institution, not Frank. Kelly kept his uniform, but his hustle went cautious. Pastor was reassigned, and stories traveled. The transfer order was delayed. Frank had won the tier and lost comfort, trading a fist fight for surveillance. He owed a favor to the old inmate who'd shouted about the service door, and he'd made enemies in badges and bunks alike. In prison, mercy and cruelty blur at distance. Frank's smile had been neither. It was a signature the block could read.